I present to you a discussion of logical fallacies, also known as verbal fallacies, also known as errors in reasoning. All these claim to be making use of logos, logic, or reason, but in actuality they do not, and so should not have a place in legitimate argumentation. Sometimes we're guilty of using these. By explaining them to you, I hope that you'll be inclined not to do so. First logical fallacy I'm talking about is the non sequitur, which means in Latin, it does not follow. And a lot of these logical fallacies do have Latin names because they were uh, considered by the Romans who were interested in rhetoric and logic and exploring those fields. So you'll notice that many of these terms are indeed in Latin. Non sequitur, again, means it does not follow, where one makes a claim and does not base it on something that would lead logically to that claim. An example is that Nellie is obsessed with basketball. She attends a game every week. Her attending a game every week is not enough to support the idea that she is obsessed with basketball. So this is a non sequitur. One idea does not follow from the other. Second Latin fallacy is ad hominem, which means toward the man or against the man or against the person. This is very common in political advertisements, basically name calling, attacking individuals on the basis of their personality or their attributes and not at all on the basis of their decisions or their policies. So for instance, if someone calls former President George W. Bush really stupid, that's simply an attack on his personality or his intelligence and is not grounded in any logical basis. One does not say, in this case, one isn't attacking Bush's policies or his particular decisions, and that would form a logical argument, whereas an ad hominem does not. Hasty generalization is, as it says, a generalization that's made quickly without a sufficient basis or a sufficient sample. To tell you a little anecdote, imagine an exchange student from Japan named Hiroki who attends school in the US. He's never been to the US, never been to New England, and the day after he arrives, he sees a white squirrel running up a tree. Goes back to his room, sends an email to his family, and tells them that all American squirrels are white. So obviously that is too hasty a generalization. It's only based on seeing one squirrel. You can imagine also a situation where someone does a survey and only questions 5 or 6 people and then draws a broad conclusion on that basis. Too small a sample set to make that judgment. These are both examples of hasty generalization. Many of the logical fallacies also have colorful names, in this case literally so. Red herring is one that I like to talk about. If you're a fan of mystery novels and mystery stories, you're familiar with the idea of a red herring, which is a distraction from whodunit. Tries to distract the reader. An author of mystery stories tries to distract the reader from guessing who the criminal is by throwing out red herrings, distractions, false suspects, false clues, and so forth. The term actually comes from fox hunting, where individuals literally rode ahead or ran ahead of the hunt, dragging fish. And these were intended to throw off the scent and make the hunt more sporting, so the hounds would not be able to easily track the fox. So the origins, even before the mystery story, before this term was applied to mysteries, comes from literal red herrings. How this might be used in argument, you can imagine a situation where a politician is being questioned about his raising taxes. In response, the politician says, before I address that, let me direct you toward my environmental policy, or let me talk about my achievements in foreign policy. So those are simply distractions from the question. They don't actually address the issue at hand. And the politician is throwing out red herrings or distractions in an effort to escape doing that. Another colorful term is poisoning the well. And this is essentially biasing the reader or the listener before he or she has a chance to hear the argument. You can imagine talking to someone and they're trying to create an impression in you of someone you haven't yet met. Perhaps they might say that your friend's boyfriend is a real jerk. So when you first meet him, you already have this impression of him based on what you've heard. So your well has been poisoned. You can imagine the well as being crystal clear water, untainted water. Someone pours poison into it and ruins it from the beginning. You can also imagine a political debate where one person has finished making her arguments and she says, before I turn the floor over to my opponent, know that he does not have the best interests of students at heart. So immediately you're biased against that individual. This is also done in courtroom dramas on television, where the prosecutor or the defense says something about, I guess it would be the defense, rather it would be the prosecutor saying something about the defendant, and then the defense objects to it, but the jury has already heard it, and the jury may be biased against that individual by hearing what the prosecutor has said. So this would be an example of poisoning the well. Back to Latin, we have post hoc ergo propter hoc, a long one, means after this, therefore because of this. It's essentially faulty cause and effect, or incorrect cause and effect. You see a picture of a black cat there because this is a common example, and post hoc ergo propter hoc usually applies to superstitions. It means you can imagine a cat crosses your path, and a little while later you have a case of bad luck, and you attribute it to the cat crossing your path. So this is a false cause and effect. Just because it happened after the incident doesn't mean that it was caused by it. So this is faulty cause and effect. There's several other examples of this, both of which come from the Middle Ages. One is the idea that salamanders were born from flames. People would take logs that they had gathered, freshly cut logs or freshly cut wood, and eventually throw it into the fire. And they'd see salamanders running out of the flames, and they drew the conclusion, therefore, that the fire gave birth to salamanders. And the fact was that the salamanders were simply hiding in the wood and were driven out by the fire. So again, faulty cause and effect. An effect is attributed to a cause that is not really the cause. And a second example is that of rats and rags. People apparently used to throw around a lot of dirty rags and leave them piled up in corners. Again, it's usually said to be during the Middle Ages. And when they pulled the rags away later, they'd find numerous rats would run out from underneath. And they would draw the conclusion that rats were born from dirty rags. Again, the rats were simply hiding under there, but because of a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, they assumed this was a cause and effect situation when it was not. Another fallacy, which is again rather colorful, is called begging the question. What this means is that one uses something that's up for debate, something that's questionable, to support the argument itself. An example would be, getting free cable should obviously be illegal, otherwise it would not be prohibited by the law. So here the fact that it's illegal is being used to argue that it should be illegal, which does not make any sense. An example from the internet, Bill says God must exist. Jill says, how do you know? Bill says, because the Bible says so. Jill asks, why should I believe the Bible? And Bill responds, because the Bible was written by God. So no matter what you believe, this would not work in terms of logic, because that which is up for question, the existence of God, is supported by the fact that God wrote the Bible. So that obviously is a circular argument. You can think of begging the question as kind of this circular type of argument that uses something that is questionable to support the argument itself. So we want to avoid that too. Another colorful fallacy is slippery slope, and this one you can imagine its meaning from the description. Basically, it means that something happens, and the assumption is that everything will then go radically downhill from that point on. An example might be that if tuition is raised this year by $100, the next thing you know, it'll be $40,000 a year. The assumption is one thing will happen, and it'll snowball, it'll roll downhill, and it'll get worse and worse till it reaches a catastrophic condition, which is often not the case, and one can't draw that conclusion, one can't make that assumption. Then we have what's called a false dichotomy, also known as a false dilemma. Dichotomy is when you're given two options, and often in life things are not black and white, they're mostly gray, and you don't have simply two choices to choose from. There are other options. Classic example of a false dichotomy: America, love it or leave it. Here you're given two choices. Either you have to love America as it is, or you have to get out. There's no third option. You can't fight to improve America. You can't debate about it. You can't write your Congress people or whatever. You just have to either love it or leave it. And this is not, it's not a cut and dry situation with just two options. Other examples: since you cannot afford a new iPod, you're just going to have to do without music for a while. Assuming that there are two possibilities, either an iPod or no music, and there are other possibilities, obviously. A little anecdote again from the internet. Bill says, Jill and I both support having prayer in public schools. Jill says, I never said that. Bill replies, you're not an atheist, are you, Jill? Not only is this attacking Jill's character, but it also sets up a false dichotomy. Either she supports prayer in schools or she must be an atheist. There's no middle ground. There are no other options. I think you have a good sense of what this false dilemma or false dichotomy looks like. Then we have apples and oranges, which most of you have heard of. It's simply comparing two things that aren't really comparable. For example, you might say, Professor Lee's class is not as good as dinner last night. And those are two different things. You can't compare them on that basis. You might be able to think of many other examples where apples and oranges are being compared. If you do a comparison, you need to compare two things that are truly comparable. Similar to apples and oranges, we have a false analogy. An analogy is a comparison that's used to illuminate something unfamiliar. Something familiar is used to help illustrate an unfamiliar thing. For example, if I say Louis XIV is the Sun King, you don't know the nature of Louis XIV, but you do know the nature of the sun. You can gather what Louis XIV is like from that analogy. However, if you're comparing two dissimilar things, then you can't use the analogy to help illuminate your meaning. For example, if I say, we put a man on the moon, so we should be able to cure the common cold, that would be a false analogy, because the science used to put someone in space is quite different from that which is used to deal with microbes or colds. Another example, employees are like nails. Just as nails are hit on the head to make them work, so too should employees be struck to get them to work effectively. Obviously, that's not an analogy that uses two comparable things. Tu quoque, back to Latin, means you also. I also call this kind of the peer pressure fallacy. Because you did it, I should be able to do it too. You cheated on the exam, so why can't I? You don't vote, so I shouldn't have to vote either. Obviously, these do not work in terms of logic. Bandwagon fallacy is quite similar to tu quoque. You may know the phrase jumping on the bandwagon. It's simply doing what everyone else is doing, also known as an appeal to the bandwagon. An example might be, everyone likes brand X chewing gum, so you should chew it too, you should like it too. Sort of a peer pressure thing as well, following the crowd. You can obviously imagine this is not true. At one time, most people in Western Europe thought that the world was flat, and yet if you believed along with them, you would not be right. And also, to paraphrase a classic statement said to children, if everyone jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? And just because everyone is doing it doesn't make it right or logical. So avoid using bandwagon fallacies, and also avoid jumping off of bridges. Why do fallacies happen? There are several reasons. First, if someone doesn't have an argument or is unfamiliar with the subject matter, or if one lacks familiarity with opposing points of view and can't answer them. And lastly, if someone simply has undeveloped methods of argument, can't reason effectively. In all these cases, the individual may resort to using logical fallacies. The kind of desperate fallbacks when one doesn't truly have any reasons to answer a particular viewpoint. So hopefully you will have adequately developed reasons. You'll do your research. You'll think of your ideas, think of your arguments before making them, and will not need to fall back on logical fallacies. However, if you want more information on fallacies, if you want to see them in further detail, there are more than I've talked about, and you can also view additional examples. Check out Stephen's Guide to Logical Fallacies. The hyperlink is given here. Unfortunately, the video is not hyperlinkable. Is that a word, hyperlinkable? I cannot hyperlink the video, but you can copy this link if you pause the video, or you can simply do a search